Good afternoon, everyone. Please take a seat. I know someone will join, but let's make the most of this exciting time together. We are at the end of the first conference after quite a long time, and what a great one. We are very grateful for the local organizer to have this opportunity, and what a better way to end up than an Oxford-style debate on one of the topics that was the most addressed during the conference, actually. This conference was entitled Reshaping IB for Sustainable Development in a Post-Pandemic Era. My name is Valentina de Marchi. I'm based at the University of Padova, and today I'm happy to lead you to this very interesting debate that takes at the core the question that you also see on the screen. Will multinationals make meaningful contribution to post-pandemic sustainable development? So many contributions during this EIBA conference was taking at the core the sustainable development or some specific goals of it, and to what extent it is possible for different actors to drive to better society. So now we want to focus on the role of MNEs, which is actually what we are used to study the most. And we saw in many papers focus on responsibility actions, but also in irresponsibility actions of the companies, and on their action strategy, but also emerging a discussion on the outcomes. Will really things change after the strategies that firms implement? Do they have the willingness really to change things and improve their performance? So today we're going to have a very interesting discussion with two speakers in favor and two against. And given it is the very last moment of the conference of a very busy day, we have asked our speaker to be very provocative in their discussion and trying to push a little bit so to make it more interesting and also potentially more fun. So the first in favor of the positive role of multinationals to make a meaningful contribution to a post-pandemic era will be Jonathan Doe. I don't think any of our speakers will need to be presented, so I will be very fast on this just to leave space for discussion. Then we'll have against Elisa coming and trying to convince us of a very different view. And then Sarianna will join us. Unfortunately, she was not able to be here in person, but we have Sarianna connected via Zoom. Hi, Sarianna. She was able to connect before. Hopefully, yes. Okay, now I see her. And Alvaro is going to end up trying again to take us in the against position of this discussion. But before we ask our speaker to convince us, let's see what we do think about this issue. So what I'm asking you to do now is to use your mobile phone. We were all used to do this in our classes, I guess. We also know this platform. You can see the link on the top, or you should also be able to take a picture of the QR code. The link is www.booklab.com/EIBA 2021. And so that's booklab, that's a P, maybe it's not well seen. And what I'm asking you to do is to give us your opinion. Are you in favor or against? Do you believe that multinationals can make meaningful contribution to drive the society toward a sustainable development, to use this opportunity of COVID-19 to move for the better, so to move to a better situation? Or are you against this? Do you think they are not willing to or not able to? So let us know what your views is. I will try to see it right away, what your votes are. And so let's keep voting. We will see the percentages going on and see what you think about those issues. And we're going to ask you again afterwards. So we're going to see who of the teams, the in favor teams or the against team, is going to convince us in this view. So just giving you the last second if you want to vote. And again, let me show again what the link is to let us know what you think about this issue, if you are in favor or if you are against, using the link that you see on the top. so leaving also to the latecomers the time to see it. But now that's the time then to start with this discussion. So we'll ask Jonathan to come here and let us know why he's in favor and why I picked this picture that should allow us to better understand why we should vote yes to that poll.
I don't think I need this stool. Well, thank you, Madam Chair, esteemed panelists, distinguished colleagues, for having us here today to discuss this very important issue. So I am joining you here today to speak in favor of the motion that MNEs will make meaningful contributions to post-pandemic sustainable development. I'm going to divide my short comments into three main points. First, markets can, have had, and will continue to have profound impacts on sustainable development across sectors and geographies. Two, multinationals have stepped up even in cases when governments have not. And three, multinationals have and will continue to partner with governments and civil society to make a discernible impact on sustainable development. In these remarks, I'm going to touch on a couple of the UN SDGs, not all of them. For example, I won't discuss UN SDG number 1, no poverty, or number 2, zero hunger, because frankly, it would have been just too easy. We know from our colleagues that foreign direct investment does have positive impacts on those SDGs, but I've chosen a couple others to focus on instead. Number 12, responsible consumption and production. Number 13, climate action. And number 17, partnership for the goals. So first point, markets can and have had profound impacts on sustainable development, and I'm going to use the examples of responsible production and consumption. We've had a myriad of initiatives among multinationals, NGOs, and governments to help multinationals in their productive capacity to produce goods and services that are increasingly sustainable. Two examples. The Forest Stewardship Council, a path-breaking global initiative to certify forest products as being harvested and produced in a sustainable fashion. Over 20 years, more than 400 million acres of forest have been certified under the FSC. An analogous initiative, but here for fisheries and marine stewardship. The Marine Stewardship Council, again, a broad global initiative that is driving change among fishing and fisheries around the world. Over half the world's wild salmon, 58%, is now produced in a fashion that is MSC certified. 54% of tuna. This initiatives have now been extended to farmed seafood, which of course is where we draw much of our fish and shellfish from in the current environment. So the first point is that markets can and have had and will continue to have powerful impacts on sustainable development. Number two, multinationals stepped up even when governments did not. And here I'm going to be speaking a little bit US-centric. But of course, when President Trump took office in 2017, he okay, I'm showing my opponent's war chest here. Not a good practice. Multinationals stepped up even when governments were not. So when President Trump was elected in 2016, you recall he repudiated many environmental and other sustainability initiatives, including the Paris Climate Agreement, including the corporate average fuel economy standards. So what happened, the private sector spoke up and took action and committed to a whole host of climate reduction targets and climate adaptation initiatives. Literally hundreds of multinationals around the world signed numerous collective agreements to lower emissions, to conserve energy, and to contribute positively to climate action, even during an era when governments, at least one very powerful government, was stepping back. Number three, multinationals are working in close consort with governments and NGOs to promote sustainable development. And we've seen that just recently in the COP26 meeting when U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen noted in her remarks, as big as the public sector effort is across all our countries, the $100 trillion price tag to address global climate change globally is far bigger, and the private sector needs to play a bigger role. I will point to the slide here and invoke a famous quote from a movie, "Show me the money." Show me the money. Where is the money coming from? It's coming from private sector production and, of course, consumption. Without those resources, we would be nowhere. So if this resolution was, do multinationals exclusively, solely, or unilaterally responsible for addressing climate change in a meaningful way, I would say, of course not. But that is not the resolution before us. The resolution is, will they address in a meaningful way post-pandemic sustainable development? And they will, but they will do so in consort with other important actors. And so at Glasgow, we had a whole range of initiatives coming out of the COP26, such as the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, the Climate Finance Partnership, and a whole range of initiatives addressing that UN SDG 13 climate action. So to conclude, multinationals they will continue to make meaningful contributions to post-pandemic sustainable development by leveraging the power of markets, by stepping up when governments can't or won't, by partnering with governments and civil society to advance a more sustainable future. Thank you.
What an energetic start. So now will be top time for the against team with Elisa to try to safeguard different perspective. And we already saw a little bit this picture, but we're now curious to know why you pick it and what you want to tell us regarding this picture.
Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. So I will argue against the motion that multinationals will make meaningful contributions to post-pandemic sustainable development. And to argue against this motion, I want to make three simple points. So the first point is, what is the post-pandemic and how is it going to look like? And the post-pandemic will most likely look like a perennial pandemic, because there are high chances that we will be entering an era of heightened uncertainty and risk, which is much more riskier than we are used to, especially in high-income economies. And there is going to be much uncertainty because scientists have predicted that there would be more pandemics over time. And even if government and supranational institutions will learn how to handle pandemics, the numbers say that there will be more and more. So let me remind you some of the recent escalations of new infectious disease threats. SARS in 2003 and 4, H5N1 in 2005, H1N1 in 2009, MERS-CoV in 2012, Ebola in West Africa 2013, and 2018 in DRC, and Zika in 2015. Each revealed new gaps, national and global preparedness. And then COVID arrived and corroborated the view that pandemics might be more common in the future than it had in the past. And this heightened risk of pandemic is coupled also with a high risk coming with climate change, and we know all about it. And actually, there is research showing how climate change is bringing to the fore the rise of new pathogens. So even climate change is exacerbating the prospects of having more pandemics. Now, of course, I'm not intending here to depress you, of course, but I think it's good to acknowledge that we are entering a more uncertain and risky future, and this is going to be more uncertain and risky for people, but also for MNEs. And that's the first point that leads me to the second point. And I'm asking these questions: why on earth we believe, or should we think, that in a context of rising risk and uncertainty, MNEs will make meaningful contributions to sustainable development, if they have not done so far, okay, in less stormy periods? And on this front, let me take a step back and dispel any doubt in the room that MNEs have been helping sustainable development goals and the achievement of sustainable development goals in the past. Just to be clear, I know some of you in the room might be convinced of that, but I'm trying to dispel this idea. And let's take one central theme in the sustainability debate, which is inequality, which is goal 10 of the SDG 2030 agenda. We know from the work of political scientists, sociologists, anthropologists, and also now, more recently, from the acknowledgement of renowned economists like Nobel laureate Joe Stiglitz or even Danny Roderick, that the benefits of globalizations have not been evenly distributed. And I quote Roderick here, 2018, Straight Talk on Trade, when he says, growing volumes of trade with countries at different levels of development and with highly dissimilar institutional arrangements exacerbated inequality and economic insecurity at home. But guess who orchestrated the growing volumes of trade? Not governments, but companies, typically large M&Es through their so-called value chains, global value chains. And global value chains look like a good idea to many of us, right? But we know also that workers down the value chains in low-income countries have been increasingly subject to exploitation-like working conditions, while at the same time, this organization of production has exerted growing pressures on higher-income countries where wages have gone down, together with social protection and safety at work. So through this very and highly efficient system, which we all study about, lead firms in GVCs have become big capital owners and have concentrated both political and economic power. And as the work of David Authors and colleagues and Piketty and Associates suggests, economic concentration of income and wealth is higher for owners of capital, not for laborers. And for this reason, we have experienced high concentration of wealth in the hands of a few since the 1980s when globalization started. So let's accept, therefore, that this is the way capitalism and its institutions are currently structured, okay? So this is a structural feature of capitalism, and no matter how many donations and how many good sustainability practices M&Es are going to put on the table, the whole system is now structured in this way to be a sort of factory of growing within country inequality, which we have to consider as a key structural characteristics. And there is one book by Katarina Pistor where she clearly identifies how also the legal system has basically shaped and designed this system in a way that is very much going to last like it is. So the third point here is, why would a post-pandemic scenario characterized by heightened risk and uncertainty change these very much structural characteristics of the organization of production and economic generation and distribution that we have now? And I argue that it won't. One reason is, if we want to go to theory, think about the theory of irreversible investments that has persistently demonstrated over time that uncertainty is enemy to long-term investments, which is what is needed to address the most pressing sustainability problems we have. Uncertainty triggers short-term orientation in firms, and short-term is not good for long-term planning of our societies. Hence, I conclude that M&Es won't be the solution. Governments and supranational institutions can be the solution, but they need to have the courage to enforce radically different policies, to reorganize capitalism and changing some of these basic pillars in order to give and to get to a better society. So I hope that I've convinced you that M&Es are not game changers here in this game and that you can vote against the motion. Thank you.
Thanks, Elisa. I guess people now is trying to think a different way after Jonathan and Elisa have changed the discussion. So now that's time to discuss against the four. So why would multinational corporations be driving, moving towards sustainable development? So now it's Sarianna's time, but just let me add, Sarianna, let me add a little bit more pressure on you and add what are the results of the first poll we have done. Because despite we are all here, experts of multinational corporation, it seems that the majority is not that convinced yet that multinational corporation could actually drive a change. And we have 54% that is against the motion. So now it's pressure on you, Sarianna, to keep convincing the audience that yes, multinational can do it. The floor is yours.
Are so substantial that if you remove multinationals from the equation, we will not get the outcomes that we want. So let me move the discussion a little bit into the realm of business-to-business activity, particularly infrastructure-related activity. Here is where we are not talking about vague commitments. We are not talking about glossy reports. We are not talking about things that may happen one day in the future. We are talking about concrete projects that can be seen, that can be, that actually affect the environment that we live in. The picture that I have chosen is from a company. It's a company that is taking part in reshaping this future, reshaping the infrastructure that we use, particularly in the energy sector. It is only one company. This is a company that's occupies itself in the energy sector, building plants, energy plants, as well as in the marine sector. But I could have chosen other firms. It wouldn't have to be this sector. But what I find interesting about this picture and why I think you should maybe reconsider your point is that when we ask ourselves, what is it that multinationals bring to the table? Then one of the key things has to be technological innovation and the ability to transfer knowledge across borders and the ability to engage in investment, even at a time of uncertainty, through experimentation, through some kind of real options, but to engage in investment. Now, I am focused here. This picture is from one of the pioneers. It's from one of the companies that is really actively trying to shape the options. And what you see there in the picture are very well-established technological options in the area of the energy transition. There's wind, there's solar, but there's also much more uncertain options. The use of hydrogen, the development of fuels like ammonia that could then maybe be used in ocean transport. They are active in all these sectors. And it is by no means certain that this will pay off. It is by no means certain that 10 years from now, this will be a meaningful part of their business. But they are taking these steps because it's an organic direction of growth for the business from the origins that they come from. Now, the other thing that you see in the picture that is not visible is that there is a lot of public policy and a lot of public finance behind what you see on the screen. But all of that public finance, about $1 trillion in the green investment program of the EU, a third of all of the money that is reserved for the green transition globally, is not going to build wind parks, is not going to build solar parks on its own. It's certainly not going to develop hydrogen into a viable option for the heavier industry uses. My argument here is that we need multinationals, we need their innovation, and we need their ability to transfer technology. Let's look at the established technologies, wind and solar. You might say, well, we have the technologies, they are cost competitive, we don't need multinationals. But we do need multinationals because we are facing a situation where 220 countries around the world are going to be transitioning to net zero. They don't all have the capacity to engage in these projects themselves. They need foreign investment. And very importantly, they need those pioneering firms that have been engaging in cross-border investment in these renewable sectors. And finally, you might say, okay, I picked an industry that is clearly, these are the good guys. These are the ones that are building the energy future. But that's not really the point. I mean, we could have taken healthcare. We could have looked at even sectors like education. It gets more contentious. We could have looked at financial services and fintech. I don't argue that it isn't contentious, but in the overall infrastructure sector, we are seeing a renaissance of investment, unlike basically anything that we have seen before. in terms of the volumes of money and the volume of investment that would be needed for the transition. To me, it's quite clear that this is not just a one industry story and that multinationals play a central role. Now, the other thing you might say is in line with Mariana Mazzucato. Yes, but these firms are benefiting from so much public innovation in basic science. They are riding sort of on the coattails of this public investment. And again, I would say, yes, that's absolutely true. But that fundamental science that's being done at universities and research institutions is still not going to build us the infrastructure of the future. For that, we need multinational firms, we need innovation, we need technology transfer, and as Jonathan was arguing, we need the ability of these firms to form functioning partnerships, new generation partnerships with governments so that we can actually realize a more sustainable future. And as I said in the beginning, I think the test of meaningfulness is that if we take multinationals out of the equation, I do not believe that we will meet the goals of SDG 9 or SDG 7, affordable clean energy, or even SDG 13, climate action, or 11, sustainable cities. So there is definitely a meaningful contribution to be made, and that can be seen and heard. It isn't just empty promises. Thank you.
We are about to close the roundtable, but we're very interesting to know, and we're asked Alvaro to try to push back line, because I'm sure that Sarianna's presentation was a little bit changing up our mind. So what do you have to add to keep convincing the against team, against the motion of will sustainable development be driven by multinational? Can multinational do so?
Thank you. I think that Elisa already convinced everybody that this is not the case, so all I'm going to do is reinforce this idea, and with the notion of value creation, value capture, and who is responsible for this. Standard strategic management. What is the role of a company or a multinational? To create value for consumers and capture some of it in the form of profits. That's it. The story of sustainability, public goods, the grand challenges, what is going to happen to the world, global warming, and all these things, that's really nice. But it is not the role of multinationals. Multinationals have shareholders. What do shareholders want? Show me the money. That's the whole point of a multinational. In general, a company, if you want the broader concept. These are companies who are charged in creating value for consumers and capturing some of that value. So who is in charge of sustainability? Well, I just said it, consumers. If consumers want products that are more sustainable, if consumers want electric cars, or if they are willing to pay more for a T-shirt that is going to be produced in a more sustainable way with organic cotton, so that there is going to be less pesticides, that is going to be produced with labor that is not being abused, those are the ones that are going to drive sustainable development. It is not multinationals. The role of a multinational is to satisfy customers, because otherwise competitors will produce something that customers want because it is better quality and for the most part because it is cheaper. And this is the big, if you want, conundrum. We can achieve sustainable development when consumers, that means this table, that means you, that means me, when we start demanding that multinationals produce something that we want and we are willing to pay for this. At the end of the day, you go to the supermarket and, hey, this is €5, this is €7. Oh, that's more sustainably developed and all these things. But hey, by the way, this is so much cheaper. Yes, we as academics might think, well, I have the money and I'm willing to pay for it. The vast majority of the population in the world does not have this ability. They are going to go for those products that are going to provide them with more value for the amount of money they are going to spend. That's why if we want to promote development, sustainable development in particular, we have to change the mind of consumers. Of course, there is the alternative, and this is one of the points of, well, there is the challenge that in some cases there are externalities, consumers don't know much about this, They are unaware that products are produced with pesticides or chemicals that are polluting the land in which the factory is located, or that there is labor conditions that are really abhorrent to the consumers. Well, there is another alternative to deal with it. One is know more about it, be more informed, and that's the role of the free press, which works very well in most democratic countries. We can debate have a discussion later on the dictatorship, but that's not the point here. The point is, well, if you want change, the other, and this is back to Economics 101, if there is a problem with the market, who has to solve that problem? The government. It is the role of the government to invest in public goods, goods for which there is going to be a market failure, there is demand for the good, but the private sector is unable or unwilling to produce it, and the government can either incentivize it, provide subsidies so that there is more production of that particular good or service. It can tax it when there is some idea that, look, all this is creating harm to consumers, it is creating harm to society, so let me put a tax or ban that particular activity. Or in some cases, they can go into the story of providing it themselves. If the private sector is unwilling to do it, hey, why don't we just create it? Examples. We are in one of those examples. This is a university. It is public, it is big, it is good. The private sector was unable to provide quality education. Sorry, the private sector was unable, the public sector stepped in. So it is the government, the other, if you want, big driver of sustainable development, by reflecting what society wants and basically providing the regulations, the incentives, or in some cases, provision of those goods that society in general, consumers in general think are better. So that's, if you want, is my key point. Show me the money. Yes, just show me the money story is a story of value creation and capture. Companies are instruments for creating value for customers and capturing some of it. It is customers and governments the ones who are responsible for sustainable development. Thank you very much.
Very interesting and complementary story reported by our speakers. Examples of great companies in different sectors that can complement states and NGOs and customers' actions on the force side, and the market failure in trading off stories, and the willingness, the lack of willingness story on the against about this issue. But I think there is much more we could say about this issue, and I'm sure the speakers, but also everyone in the room, may want to contribute to this. So as I will now ask all our speakers, starting with Sarianna, to rebut and to try to take on the points discussed by the other team and trying to see if they can change it in their favor, let me also ask each of you, if you want to go back to the same link we shared before where we ask you to vote, to add if you have any question or any point. After this second round, every one of you could have the chance to pose question, and you could do also lively, but maybe we could use this opportunity to gather more questions to try to challenge again our speaker. But let me give now the floor to Sarianna to try very shortly to pick one or two points of the against team to try to rebut it. The floor is yours, Sarianna.
Thank you very much. So I will start with Alvaro's comments because they were the most recent, and then I will return to Elisa. Alvaro was arguing that if consumers if people in general want sustainable development, then they just simply need to demand it, and firms, multinationals are an instrument whereby this can then be realized. Now, that in itself is, I think, to some extent reinforcing our point, which is that you cannot take multinationals out of the equation. But I want to argue a slightly different point, which is that I was trying to bring the discussion more to the business-to-business side than the business-to-consumer. The business-to-consumer is a noisy interface. There are many ways in which both sides can be deceiving themselves. The consumers in the ways in which Alvaro already mentioned, and perhaps also the companies who do some nice projects and then fill their brochures with it. My argument on the industry and infrastructure side was that there's much less room for that kind of noisiness. It is clear when progress is being made. It is clear when standards are being improved. So I think when we look at the picture as a whole, I see much more potential for multinationals to make a meaningful contribution, even if in some sectors this can be a little bit problematic. I also don't find government intervention problematic, but then I think we need to kind of mirror this on both sides. So we have talked about governments intervening on the sort of interface that is facing firms through regulation and other things. I think we can also bring to the table government. But depending on how you feel about the primacy of the democratic process in setting our common goals, because both sides suffer from the problem that the collective is never as prominent or clear a goal as is the private interest. That's true for firms, and it's true for consumers when they make their choices. To Elisa's points, I would really like to go back to the risk argument because she was painting a picture, and I think accurately, that the world is very risky at the moment, that it might get more risky. My argument would simply be to go back to the innovation argument and the idea that firms are actually experimental engines. So who better to deal with risk? I do not believe, and I would present you evidence to counter that firms under all circumstances shy away from investment at a time of risk. Of course, in general, investors and long-term investors in particular would prefer less uncertainty. But what we are seeing at the moment in the infrastructure sector is exactly the opposite. It is long-term investments that are being made with extreme technological uncertainty about which technologies are going to be adopted. It isn't problem-free. It requires a lot of partnerships. It requires a lot of revealing of private information from the firms. But it is doable, and I do believe that it is still our best bet to have multinationals as partners in this process. Thank you.
Okay.
Alvaro, Sarianna convinced me. She got very strong topics. So would you like to start and trying to rebut to what she said or what before was said by the others?
Okay. I have, of course, a fantastic rebuttal. It's we'll nice. Yes. Give me a minute. This story of business to business is different from business to consumer. Kind of a nice excuse. At the end, we are talking about value chains, and it is business to business to business to business, and eventually there is a consumer at the end who is purchasing those products and services. It's either consumers, us, or the government. If we want sustainable development, hey, we can drive it through the chain of, look, I'm not going to buy this product unless you're producing it with certain conditions. Push your suppliers to generate that product with those conditions. Push the suppliers to not employ slave labor. Push the suppliers to employ renewable energy. Push them to not to destroy the rainforest. Push them to do whatever I think is more convenient for sustainable development. Governments and consumers are, if you want, the final purchasers of goods and services. The chain of business to business, yes, there is some capture within each business, but at the end of the day, final products goes to those main sources of purchasing. So that's kind of the story that I'm trying to present, which is if we want sustainable development, either consumers, us, demand products that are done differently from how they are, or the government does the same thing, and because it is the government, regulates industries, regulates behavior, promoting some of them, and trying to block other type of behavior. Then there's, of course, the story of the Sustainable Development Goals. Beautiful story. The United Nations came, oh, by 2020, we're going to be so nice. We're going to make all these accomplishments. We have 17 goals. What are companies doing? Well, which one do you want to pick? Which is something that my esteemed colleagues did, okay, I'm not going to discuss 17, let me pick number 9, let me pick number 3. Which color do you like? Oh, do you like the one that goes good with the red? Oh, I'll pick that color because it's nice to put it in my website. That's what is happening with the SDGs. There is a lot of rainbow washing. We knew the term greenwashing, in which companies were embracing sustainability because they were reacting to consumers, and yes, they produced really nice sustainability reports. Thick brochures, pretty pictures, lots of green everywhere, lots of very smiley, happy people in emerging economies. The behavior didn't really change that much. Then we got into the UN compact, and then it was the blue washing. Oh, I want to have the UN logo, so let me just do something that goes along those principles. Now we have the Sustainable Development Goals, which are pretty much the same story. There is no monitoring in the SDGs. There is no punishment. The United Nations allows you to use any of the logos. You cannot use the United Nations flag, but everything else is up for grabs. You can put it anywhere. You can do whatever you want. And what you are now seeing, what I have seen, lots of companies embracing them and changing their brochures, and now we have a rainbow-colored brochure. It's not changing behavior. The only way to change behavior is us, consumers, demanding that companies behave differently. It is not a story of how they are going to do it because they think it is nice and how the SDGs are going to change anything. Thank you very much.
So Sarianna's point was to show that firms has much more agency that you were suggesting, and they may have capabilities and resources to innovate greatly. But then you were going back to the point that finally what happens if all of this goes against their money-making idea, and also you take out of the hat the greenwashing approach that never came out yet, that indeed, Jonathan, might be difficult to tackle. How would you rebut to this discussion?
Easily. Let me take first Alvaro's final point, and I believe it was Elisa's second point, and that is the degree to which multinationals, foreign direct investment, and globalization has coincided with one of the most impressive eras in human history with respect to almost all measures of human health and development: poverty alleviation, longevity, infant mortality, education. All of these measures have increased dramatically under the goals prior to the UN SDGs, the Millennium Development Goals. Look it up. Look it up. It has been one of the most successful eras in human history for addressing nearly every measure or reflection of human and societal development. But Alvaro accused those on the pro side of cherry picking. Elisa chose the one human development measure, inequality, that hasn't improved. So it is the case that as China took 600 million people out of poverty in a very short period of time, that the spoils were not as evenly distributed as we might like. I concede that point. But would we prefer that all of those other measures of human development not improve in exchange for having us all poor? So we're all equal. We're all equally poor. I don't think so. Elisa's first comment about pandemics. I agree. I think we are entering an era where we may have increased frequency of pandemics. Who do we need and who do we rely on to help us get out of them? Private sector innovation. And more broadly, we're not going to get anywhere in sustainable development if we don't have continued innovations in a whole host of areas, from energy to water to housing, you name it. We must absolutely have private sector innovation to work our way through those UN SDGs. Now, Alvaro talked about multinationals being solely and exclusively responsible to shareholders. Wrong. Multinationals are responsive to an increasing myriad of stakeholders, including consumers. And the question before us does not presume any motive on the part of the multinationals. It doesn't say multinationals out of benevolence or because they're magnanimous are going to help us achieve sustainable development. It simply says they're going to make a contribution. The contribution may well be a result of pressure from consumers. It may be pressure from governments. It may be pressure from investors, likely all of those. Likely the whole constellation of stakeholders are pressuring multinationals to take more action in sustainable development, and they're doing so. So as a reminder, the resolution is simply whether multinationals will contribute meaningfully to sustainable development, not why they're doing it, and not how they're going to do it. They're going to do it partly because of the pressures the opposing team mentioned. They're going to do it in conjunction with governments, NGOs, and other stakeholders, but they're going to do it. Thank you.
Jonathan, I put also you as President of the United States. we are learning about your political skills. So Elisa, you are the last one to close. What are you going to add to this very interesting and also very lively discussion?
So to Sarianna, I think MNEs are very good at drawing nice pictures. This is something you clearly showed us. And when we think about energy transition, this is something you talked about with reference to the energy companies. I mean, I wonder whether you have taken into account that the energy transition is happening thanks to minerals, which have been extracted in places in conditions of exploitation and also exploitation of child labor. And this is well documented, and it has been consistent over time. So I was wondering whether you think that the transition is going to happen with a new model, or it's going to be the same as usual. Because if it's the same as usual, I don't see any much improvement in terms of sustainability. The other thing that Jonathan mentioned, and the fact that you had Trump doesn't mean that we need to have then McDonald's do the job. I think you need to replace Trump, as you did, rightly, with someone else who will do the job of addressing sustainability issues. So I think it's that's an issue. We have to think about who is responsible and who has the legal mandate or the political mandate actually to address these issues. And we were talking about money, and Jonathan raised the issue of money. So let's talk about money. There is this project I'm involved in, which is about universal investors. These big investors like BlackRock or Vanguard. So we're looking at where they are investing. We are looking at a portfolio of 15 trillion in assets, okay, US dollars. And we have been looking at what happens to these assets between 2014 and 2020, with 2015 being the Paris Agreement. So we see clearly that these companies, these 10 universal investors, which are the biggest one worldwide, are increasingly investing in ESG assets. So they're taking up this discourse and narratives that we have to be sustainable, and they are actually showing that they care, at least in the narrative, at least in what they can really make a reputational asset from. But at the same time, we are coding these assets in terms of their climate policy relevant sectors, so that means how much they are divesting from carbon stranded assets like fossil fuels and similar industries. And actually, guess what? Their investments in fossil fuels are not decreasing, they are increasing over this period of observation. So it seems to us from this data and this preliminary analysis, I would like to show at some point in one of these EIBA or AUDITORIO conferences, that clearly they are constructing a narrative but not actively divesting when it comes to money. They're still looking for what is more profitable, as my distinguished colleague Alvaro mentioned before. And by the way, this is consistent with work done in the area of CSR, like work by Schneider in 2020, where he creates this, he builds up this argument that I find quite convincing, that CSR-like activities are a way to legitimize capitalism to work as it has worked in the last 20 years or so, and to keep it as it is. So it's clearly there is a crisis, because the climate crisis is a crisis also of capitalism, and CSR is a way to perpetuate the model with some adjustments that are nice to look. They look nice, but they don't transform the system as such, okay? And then let me conclude on this, that, perhaps we can think of the pandemic and the post-pandemic impactful effect that firm had. And certainly there are some firms that experience a very significant, impactful effect on profits. And according to some statistics, Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna are actually earning $93.5 million US a day. So there are companies who are actually making a meaningful impact, but for their shareholders, not really for society. Exclusively, of course, they have a role in the vaccine, but that also opens up interesting questions about IPR appropriation that could be, a big issue as well to discuss today. But we don't have time. So thank you very much, and let's look at the final.
Wow, what a round of positions and rebuttals. But there is one more thing. So there is still one new element to add, because you don't know, but you have some friends in the room that is trying to support each and the other team. And we collected those in a really interesting question. So now what I would like to do, in the sake of time, but also in the sake of interest, so I will collect the question 4 that I will ask to the against team and to the for team. And I will first then ask Alvaro to reply, and then I will ask Sarianna for the for, and then Elisa and Jonathan. So we also changed a little bit the order. So interesting question for you, Elisa, came out from your discussion. You said that multinationals don't want to, but under what condition and circumstances will they be able to do so? Is there any chance that actually M&Es may make money in the future without being sustainable, if they're not taking sustainability? Given the increasing laws and demands, will still they make money without being sustainable? Sorry, I need to go through all the many questions. And is it possible that, if not M&E, smaller companies or medium-sized internationalized companies could be better able to be contributing to a sustainable development? They're more family-driven, maybe they're less connected with the local context, they may be more motivated. Is there possibility, at least for that, to be in the room? And so that would be the questions that I will ask our against team to challenge you a little bit. But there was also some challenging question for people that are supporters of the against team that I would like to ask to the for motion team. And basically, well, the first one is start by elephant in the room. Elephant in the room. For more sustainable future, shall we have less international business at all? Unless until we are not going to have a greener type of transport. And then also question, challenging you to, how do you define meaningful? When are you satisfied with about what M&Es are contributing for? When can we say that they really achieve results? And then other interesting questions like, yes, but are we disregarding that actually the contribution really depends also on specificity of the industry, on the sector, and so that's also something that really can't that well managed. Yeah, I think I will stop here for now, but there are many more other coming. Also, for example, discussing about the role of consumers to make more informed choice if they really are able to and how to go for. And also how to reconcile different aspects of positive contribution to the environment, but maybe evading taxes. So that's another question I would ask to the for team to consider what to do if firms are indeed doing something good, but also something bad. A lot of very interesting questions, and I'm not asking you to take all of them, but maybe starting with Alvaro, you want to pick one or two, and then I will leave the floor to Sarianna to pick those that were for the against, and then we are going to ask our participants to vote again, and we will see to what extent you have been convincing.
Thank you. From here. I'll take the second question that you noticed was mostly for me. Can multinationals make money if they are not sustainable? The answer is yes. There are lots of companies which are producing goods that we think are polluting and that we need. Oil companies are still operating. They will continue operating unless we go into a full transition on sustainable energy. Even then, we are going to see companies that are doing products or creating products or services which we don't think are that sustainable. It is us consumers demanding change. It is us buying an electric car rather than a big SUV. Oh, the SUV looks so much better. I can have this so much more space. Why don't you buy a nice little car? And I'm not talking about a Tesla. I'm talking about a Nissan Leaf, for example. A small, compact electric. No, I'm willing to buy a much bigger car. It gives me a status. Why are there some changes? Well, there are some incentives, and this is regulation. We are in Madrid. Why is it that all of a sudden there is a push for buying electric or hybrid cars? Because the government of the city has decided that if you want to come into the center of the city, you cannot come in with your car if it is polluting more than a certain amount of CO2. Which means that for a lot of people, there has been a regulatory incentive to try to buy those products. It is us driving those behaviors, and companies will continue producing what we think is better for us. If we want cheaper food, if we want cheaper textiles, if we want something that is not as sustainable, companies will be there and they will be making money. Because remember, there is this story of efficiency. Companies that are more efficient are the ones that are more profitable. And the push for efficiency comes in many cases at the expense of the environment, in some cases at the expense of labor, but it is up to us to demand that we want products that are going to be more sustainable for the environment. We want products that are going to be more produced with better labor standards. If we want that, there is going to be a premium paid for that, and companies will basically make that money. The story is consumers or the government are going to be driving sustainability, and companies are going to be making money either way.
Thank you. What about Sarianna's responses to some of these very, very interesting questions? Some are really keep coming and talking about, for example, discussion about meat shapes of how we can drive a positive change. So there was a lot of questions that I'm curious to hear, Sarianna, which one you will pick and how you will go for that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So if I can, I would pick two because they are linked in my mind. So I think the second question was, how do we define meaningful? Where do we know when we are there? When is good enough good enough? And then what I put as number 4, which is how do we deal with firms that are good and bad at the same time? You mentioned some examples, firms that may be very aggressive in their tax planning, but then are on the other hand doing good things environmentally or something like that. I would even go back to Elisa's earlier comment about battery technologies requiring a lot of minerals, which are mined under conditions that are not right. My answer to that would be that I would go back to what Jonathan said earlier and in all simplicity say motivation doesn't matter. What matters are outcomes. And I think if we focus on outcomes and we forget about virtue signaling in all its forms, then I think that meaningful change can be seen in real life, investment projects, in process improvements, all kinds of metrics that are reasonably difficult to falsify. Whether it matters that firms can be good on one side and can be bad on the other side, from my point of view, it doesn't. And I think when we go back to the motion of whether we want multinational firms to be part of this process, I would still strongly say yes. There's nothing in their behavior that would make me say that because they are behaving suboptimally in one dimension, we should ignore their contribution in the other. At the same time, I would argue together with Elisa that there is no reason why we can't have better standards in mining. This goes back to what Alvaro was saying, there needs to be a demand, there needs to be enough push on the firms, but like Jonathan said, when firms are pushed, they comply. I don't find that this really casts a stain on the energy industry as such. The mining sector needs to improve its practices, that's clear. I would not hold that against the companies that are transferring green technology across borders.
Thank you, Sarianna. I will just move straight away to Elisa and then to Jonathan to pick up more questions and keep the discussion going.
Okay, so yeah, I was captured by one question. I think I understood it. Can a company afford to make money without being sustainable? That's a good question, but so my view here is that it's a question of time. Okay, if the loss of value for a company of not being sustainable, whatever it means, is lower than the lifetime of the planet, then the question becomes trivial. And so I think we have to think in a different way about these issues. And I think we have to debunk one unitary truth, which is that companies cannot afford, especially large ones, to be more responsible towards society and the environment. I think we have both in this, believed in these assumptions for too long, and that's not true. I would say, quoting some of the work by Gabriel Zuckman and colleagues about how much of the corporate profits end up in tax havens, that suggests that there is a lot of money floating around that could be used to make a better world, and that in that case, companies can make a difference, okay? But they haven't so far. So I was wondering what my colleagues for the other motion would think, the pandemic would not change that unless there are rules and there are international agreements for making this money go back from tax havens and into the production function to build a more responsible value chain. And that means investment. You have to raise wages, you have to ensure better safety at work, you have to have plants that contaminate less. That means investment. So you have to siphon off the resources where they get abnormally accumulated by wrong corporate governance decisions back to the value chain, and then you will find something working. But then, to do so, we need governments and supranational institutions to impose on companies, because it's clear that companies don't do that. They have demonstrated they don't. So that's it.
Thanks, Elisa. Jonathan, to close the round, and then the opportunity to vote.
Thank you. I'll address my first brief comments to the question about the elephant in the room. And the short answer is I don't personally know, I'm not sure anybody in this room knows for sure whether there will or will not be less multinational business activity post-pandemic than there was pre-pandemic. But if there is less, it's bad news for sustainable development. Because as I remarked in my earlier comments, the vast and impressive accomplishments in human health and well-being have coincided with the big era of global business, globalization, and foreign direct investment. And we're already seeing some of the negative consequences for the developing world from the limitations and constraints in markets and integration that have resulted from the pandemic. So if it is the case that we see less multinational business post-pandemic, it's bad news for sustainable development. Finally, let me return to a point I made earlier that I was reminded by my esteemed colleague to my left, and that is to agree with the motion that multinationals will make a meaningful contribution to sustainable development is not to suggest that governments are irrelevant, or that international governmental organizations are irrelevant, or that consumers are irrelevant. It's simply saying that multinationals have a role to play. And I would be the first to say that governments have to be significant and substantial traffic cops, regulators, intermediaries, you name it. However, governments fail too. We have a panelist on the panel here today who is an expert on corruption. And one of the things he and others have found is that in corrupt societies, corrupt governments, governments don't work well at all. That's why the lion's share of international development assistance is no longer government to government, because there are too many governments that are unable or willing to do their job. And so other organizations, other institutions, including international government agencies, including donor governments, and including multinationals and NGOs, are filling the void, filling the gap. Thank you.
Very few minutes left, but I guess everyone is curious to know what your vote would be. So if you go again to the same link, www.booklab.com/EIBA 2021, let us know what you think. What is your view? Multinational will make meaningful contribution to post-pandemic sustainable development. Do you agree or do you disagree? We have heard a lot of perspectives in this position, and I thank a lot all the speakers because they played with us a little bit, pushing in one or the other direction for the sake to make us enjoy this moment, but also to keep thinking through about what could be. Even not just what is the response to this question, but how this question per se can stimulate our thinking as scholars and research in this direction. So as I'm giving you the time to vote, and please, all of us, let's do that, let me wrap up. And it's very difficult or impossible for me to summarize the many and great insight it was given. But I will try to highlight some notes in this line. First, we are talking of this question in a very relevant moment. COVID-19 has been changing the landscape for the good or the bad. And many of us would agree that it has been accelerating. What a perfect moment to keep accelerating in the direction of a better society and of a better way to manage global value chains and multinational activities. Now, what we want, what we expect, what we would like is for M&As to drive this development. Are they going to be? Well, maybe many of us would have liked for a third button to be out there and being depends. And this depends on, well, sustainability. Sustainable development is a multifaceted concept. And this means that sometimes there may be trades-off among the components. And also, they may be difficult to get what the components are, what the goals should be, what the more challenging issues are. But it's also true that it depends, because it depends on how M&As can drive the change. It's true that M&As represent the largest majority of production activities. That was a comment that emerged from one of you before, which we didn't have the time to read. So that's a very relevant question we are making. Can and will, yes, but depends on the ability of M&As to go beyond short-termism. So to be able to plan for the longer time and to account for uncertainties, because crises are going to be many. So how to go for that? It also depends on the ability to drive change and to use innovation as a leverage in this direction, and maybe also to be trying to push more radical changes than maybe so far have been done. And also, it will depend on the ability of M&As to understand themselves as part of a broader network. M&As are not alone. That was something that was cross-cutting the for, the and against, but they are a powerful actor in a broader landscape, including consumers and governments. And all of them, and it's important to understand to what extent they can work to go in the same direction. And we here can be engaging in this discussion in so many different respects, because we are all consumers and we are all voting. We are all maybe consulting or giving suggestions via what we are writing to to multinational corporations. But also, we can be actor for the change. And I guess what I'm taking home of this very interesting discussion is also what are those aspects? How could I reflect those aspects in the way I'm doing my research? How should those questions challenge the way we are going research? And I think, well, it's great upfront to say, as a sustainability scholar, I'm feeling more sustainability than I be, but actually, I have to say it's really great how many of us are studying these issues in different perspectives, looking at more on the human rights or more environmental issues, looking from the M&E's perspective, from the small firm perspective, from the government perspective. But it's very great to see that many of us are putting our great energies in understanding those directions. But let me add maybe 4 points on how we could do for that to take the most of this direction before we go to give the answer to the poll, because that's what we're interested about. First, COVID is changing everything, and we are pressured to change very fast. We shall also ourselves try to be the most radical and innovative, and even try to risk interdisciplinarity, to try to risk uncomfortable research questions, and really trying to go and look research questions that are meaningful, on which we can provide a meaningful contribution, the same we would like M&Es to provide. Not just research questions that fits very well within our own path, but what are the questions that really need to be addressed for all the system to go in that direction? And what are the dark sides that we may need to uncover? What are the aspects we have never gone and studied? Also because maybe difficult to collect the data or to get in that context, but what are the black box that we need to address to understand what are the circumstances that make M&E's willingness to, able to, capable of? And also, what are the resources and the elements that are needed to? I think one of the elements cross-cutting was this, I said it before, M&Es cannot go alone. So how could we include that systemic picture into our 10,000-word journal articles? And finally, this is an aspect I'm really keen about. Especially, we want to talk about meaningful contribution. So why don't we also start studying more and more outcomes and not just practices? What are really the results of what companies do, not just what actions they do? Because it's true that sometimes they are willing, but they're not doing something that goes in the right direction. Basically because what the right direction is has never been measured and captured. Very important and challenging aspect for us too as researchers, but maybe we can also take COVID-19 as a disruptive event to keep pushing more and more this agenda. Yeah, thanks. Will multinational make meaningful contribution to post-pandemic sustainable development? That was the question we challenged you for. And at the beginning, most of you, and I have to say someone left, so that's also a question of number, but let's not be so academical now. So before, the question was finding more support for the against team. After this nice discussion, I'm happy to report that the for team actually won, and we have now a 63% of agree. So with these results, let us give again a big roll of applause to our speakers. So thank you everyone again, and see you later on at the gala dinner.
So eloquent and so knowledgeable. Really.